Hello everybody, I am Evelil and I will tell you one story of a good viewing. The old church had been abandoned for nearly a century. It stood alone on a hill, surrounded by dead trees and an air of forgotten whispers. No one in the nearby town of Ashford dared go near it. Stories had circulated for decades, stories of disappearances, strange shadows moving behind its shattered stained glass, and a pulsing sound that could be heard from within, like a great heart beating underground. The locals spoke of the church in hushed tones, avoiding it as though it were a living thing, something alive and hungry, something that thrived on fear. No one dared set foot inside, not after the priest from the town before last vanished without a trace. Some said it was the work of a curse, others swore it was the devil's domain, and there were those who believed the church itself had been the birthplace of something far darker. But Father Gabriel was different. He was a man of great faith, strong in his convictions, sent by the diocese to cleanse what had been deemed a cursed place. He carried with him a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded, and a silver cross passed down through generations of priests. He knew the stories, but they were only stories. There was nothing that a man of God couldn't overcome. The darkness had no power over the light of faith. Gabriel was certain of that. The townsfolk pleaded with him not to enter, warned him about the strange happenings, the disappearances, the disquieting whispers that haunted the church's ruins. But Gabriel only smiled, a slight curl of his lips as he patted his chest where his cross hung. "Fear is the weapon of the wicked," he said, and with that he climbed into his horse-drawn cart and made his way up the hill, leaving behind the whispers of the frightened town. As he approached the church, a cold shiver crawled up his spine. It stood taller than he remembered, its once gleaming stonework now weathered and cracked. The bell tower loomed ominously against the night sky, its peak hidden by the fog that clung to the land like a thick blanket. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest hint of something wrong. Gabriel felt the weight of his mission. He was not just here to restore the church, to perform an exorcism, but to reclaim this land from the grip of whatever evil had claimed it. He stepped from the cart, his boots sinking into the soft earth, and made his way up the creaking steps of the church. As he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the air in his chest. But Gabriel did not flinch. Inside, the air was thick, humid, almost alive. The church smelled of mold and decay, yet there was something else beneath that, an underlying sweetness, as if something was rotting and blooming at the same time. The faintest trace of copper hung in the air like blood. The pews, once finely crafted, were now rotted and the wood had darkened with age. Yet strangely, the altar was pristine. The stone slabs beneath it were undisturbed, and the gold trim on the pulpit gleamed in the dim light, untouched by the passage of time. At the center of the altar was a book open to an impossible page. Gabriel approached slowly, his heart beginning to race in his chest. He had expected old books, dusty relics from past centuries, but this one was different. It didn't belong here. Its pages were covered in veins, a dark network of blood vessels that seemed to pulse and writhe under the surface. The veins were not part of the paper, they had formed the paper itself. The texture of the pages was wet to the touch, slick like the skin of something alive. He reached out, fingers trembling slightly, and ran his hand across the open page. It was warm. Unnaturally warm. A low hum filled his ears, so faint at first he thought it was a figment of his imagination, but then it grew louder, a low, rhythmic thrum. It was as though the book itself had a heartbeat. The whispers began. They were soft at first, just barely audible, like the rustling of leaves. But the longer Gabriel stood there, the louder they became. Faint voices speaking in a language he did not recognize, a language that seemed to vibrate in his very bones, curling around his thoughts. He shook his head, trying to clear the strange sensation, but it lingered, gnawing at the edges of his mind, pulling at the corners of his sanity. The book seemed to react to his touch, the veins twisting and shifting beneath the surface of the pages. Gabriel stepped back, his eyes widening. Something about the book unsettled him on a primal level, something he could not explain. As if the book itself were waiting for him to make the next move. And then the pulsing began. At first, it was just a faint tremor in the ground, barely noticeable. But as Gabriel stepped back again, something heavy shifted beneath the church. A groan echoed through the air, low and guttural, like the sound of ancient wood cracking under the weight of something immense. The floor beneath him began to ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen force. Suddenly, the altar shifted. A great crack appeared along the stone, splitting down the center. The entire structure began to break apart, and out of the abyss that formed beneath it, a massive hand, long and skeletal, emerged. The hand was covered in rotted flesh, veins tangled across it like dark ivy, and as it gripped the edge of the altar, the blood-like veins seemed to pulse in time with the rhythm of the whispers. Father Gabriel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew thick, Heavier, suffocating, and with a sickening lurch, the creature began to rise. The shadows in the church coiled around it, moving like liquid smoke, and as the figure's form emerged fully from the earth, Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. The creature was grotesque. Its body was barely human, twisted and deformed, covered in a patchwork of skin and exposed bone. The veins that ran across its body were thick, swollen, pulsating with a strange, liquid energy that shimmered in the dim light. It had no eyes, only a wide, cavernous hollow where its face should be. Yet Gabriel felt the weight of its gaze as it turned toward him, sensing his every movement. It was holding something in its hands, an instrument that looked like a quill but made of bone, sharpened to a wicked point. It raised the quill to its mouth and with a low, rasping whisper, began to dip it into the blood that oozed from the pages of the book. The book was bleeding. Thick, dark blood poured from the veins on the pages, spilling across the altar and dripping onto the floor in heavy, pulsing waves. Gabriel stumbled backward, his eyes wide with horror. The creature raised its head, tilting it as if listening to something Gabriel could not hear. The whispers grew louder, now a cacophony of voices, screaming, chanting, crying out in a language so old it made Gabriel's skin crawl. The words began to form in the blood as the creature wrote, the quill tracing letters, words, symbols that seemed to twist and shift as they appeared. Each word was more grotesque than the last. And then, slowly, the creature's quill scrawled one final message directly beneath the name of the priest. It has begun. Gabriel's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the words. His name had been written not in ink, but in blood. The blood of the book, the blood of the beast that had risen. And in that moment he realized the truth. The creature wasn't just a guardian of the book. It was the author. The book had been waiting for him, waiting to write his name into its veins, to claim his soul as part of its terrible, living history. He turned to flee, but the aisle, once clear, had disappeared. The pews had shifted, rearranged into walls of writhing flesh, their surfaces slick and glistening like the inside of a living organism. They pulsated, breathing in sync with the rhythmic pounding of the book's heartbeat. The walls closed in on him, trapping him in a nightmare he couldn't escape. He could feel the blood-soaked pages tearing at his flesh, dragging him toward the altar, pulling him toward the creature. And as the words began to scrawl themselves into his own skin, he understood. He was part of the story now. The story would never end. Father Gabriel's screams echoed through the church, his voice rising in a mix of terror and disbelief as the creature drew closer. The air had become thick and suffocating, as though the church itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with the pulsing veins that wrapped around the walls. The shadows, once inert, now swirled around him like a storm of black smoke, reaching out to caress his skin, to drag him deeper into the nightmare. His body jerked violently, his muscles straining as if something unseen was pulling him toward the altar. His hands clawed at the floor, scraping at the cold stone beneath him, but the blood seemed to have a will of its own. The veins, thick and writhing, burrowed into his flesh like worms, sending waves of unbearable heat through his body. Each breath became a struggle, each heartbeat a thunderous reminder that the book was alive and it wanted him. Father Gabriel, a voice rasped, smooth and seductive, but filled with malevolent hunger. The creature had spoken. But the voice wasn't just from the beast, it came from every direction, as if the very walls themselves were whispering his name. The sound slithered into his mind, crawling beneath his skin, threading through his veins, making his thoughts muddled and fragmented. The beast, now looming above him, raised its bony hand, quill still clutched in its grasp. Its fingers were long and spindly, ending in jagged talons, but there was something almost delicate about the way it held the bone. It dipped the quill into the dark blood, its eyes hollow and empty, the blackness within them swirling like an endless abyss. The creature leaned forward, its voice barely a whisper now. "You are part of it, Gabriel. You always were. The Bible, you have written your place in it." Gabriel's breath caught in his throat. His head swam as the blood seemed to pool in his vision, the veins in the book pulsing faster, more urgently now, the writing on the pages moving as if it were seeking something. Something new. With a sickening lurch, Gabriel's body was dragged across the floor, his legs buckling beneath him. He gritted his teeth, praying under his breath for salvation, for deliverance from this infernal nightmare. But the book was all-consuming, the words written on its pages now seeming to stretch and expand, crawling across every surface, filling the church with an overwhelming presence. The creature's hollow face seemed to lean closer, and Gabriel could feel the heat of its breath, foul and putrid, as it whispered into his ear. "You'll be written in the blood, Father. You'll join the others." The words held no pity, no mercy. Only the cold certainty of an eternity bound to the living book, to the Bible that fed on the souls of those who dared enter its domain. The creature's quill hovered above his chest, poised to write, and for a moment Gabriel thought it might be the end. His name would be etched into the pages, a part of this cursed text forever. his fate sealed in ink forged from blood. But as the quill descended, a blinding light erupted from his cross. The silver pendant that hung around Gabriel's neck began to glow, first a faint shimmer, then an unbearable brilliance that flooded the room, filling the shadows with burning radiance. The creature recoiled, its eyes snapping toward the cross, and for the first time, Gabriel saw a flicker of something akin to fear in its empty gaze. The creature screamed, a screech that rattled the very foundations of the church, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality itself. The light from the cross grew brighter, pushing back the shadows, forcing the blood-soaked veins to retreat, retracting into the pages of the book. Gabriel felt himself being freed from the creature's grasp, though his limbs were heavy, his body bruised from the pull. But before he could stand, the book shuddered. The veins that had retreated from the walls, the pews, and the altar suddenly began to crawl back. They twisted, reshaped, reappeared, surging from the pages in a violent spasm. The walls of flesh that had once been static were now in motion, coiling and undulating like the body of a great, monstrous snake. The book itself screamed, a cacophony of agony and rage that reverberated through the walls. Gabriel looked down in horror. The words, his name, his identity, had begun to carve themselves into his skin. It wasn't a mere mark. The blood in his veins seemed to bleed out and rewrite him. The quill from the creature's hand had already etched the beginning of his transformation, but now it was as though the church itself was finishing the job. The veins on his body twisted beneath his skin, moving and pulsing with dark energy. His fingers trembled as they brushed over the blood-seeping words that had appeared, now burned into his very flesh. Gabriel, the Eternal. A violent, searing pain shot through his chest. The veins inside him seemed to grow, becoming larger, thicker, spreading outward from the very core of his heart. He gasped for air, choking on the blood that filled his throat. But the words continued to burn, carving themselves deeper into his flesh with every passing moment. "No," Gabriel gasped, his voice breaking with terror. "No, I won't be. I can't be." But the veins responded with a mocking laugh, a twisted, sickening sound that came from the very book. The creature, its shadow now looming above him, laughed as well, low and guttural. "You were always meant to be part of it. Every name written in blood serves the purpose," the creature whispered. "The Bible will never be finished, Gabriel. Not until it has written every soul, every name, in its pages." With that, the book pulsed violently, sending a shockwave of blood surging through the church. The walls of flesh around him retracted, pulling back into the shadows. Gabriel stumbled, his knees buckling as he tried to stand. He could feel the book's weight in his chest, pulling at his very soul, trying to absorb him into its veins. And then the whispers started again. They were no longer faint. They were loud all around him, in every corner of the church. Each word seemed to bleed into him, carving into his mind like a brand. It wasn't just the book that was alive. The church was alive too. The ground beneath his feet began to crack open, and through the fissures, Gabriel saw what lay beneath, countless souls, each one screaming, their faces twisted in eternal agony. They were trapped, their bodies bound to the church, forever written into the blood-soaked pages. Gabriel was dragged toward the altar, unable to fight the weight pulling him down, unable to fight the overwhelming pull of the blood-soaked Bible. His skin felt as though it were burning, but he couldn't scream. His voice had been stolen, along with his will, swallowed by the overwhelming power of the book. And as he sank to his knees before the altar, he realized his name had been written into it. He was part of the story now. The book had no end. The book would never end. Father Gabriel's body was consumed by the darkness. The veins crawled deeper into his skin, joining the eternal cycle. And as the last of his consciousness slipped away, the book, the creature, and the church all became one. The Bible was whole. And the blood continued to write. Thank you very much and see you all in the next video. Love you guys.